So good morning. Welcome to Lunch and Learn. I'm Carrie Ann Sparks, and I have with me Dr. Laura Thompson. And today we are going to talk about misconceptions of online learning. And specifically, online courses can only be taught synchronously. So we will get into what that means and what we can do about it. So first is the myth. And the myth is that in online courses, synchronous lectures are the only way to go. You know, that sitting here on a Zoom and talking to students, or even in person talking to students, that's how students learn best. And I included this picture of Charlie Brown because I think we all remember how the teacher's voice sounds in Charlie Brown. And I think sometimes our lectures sound that way, even though we want to make them, very exciting and interesting to students. And this whole semester, we're talking about misconceptions of online learning, and it comes from this article for misconceptions of online learning that Laura just dropped in the chat for us. If you're interested in learning more, that is a great place to check out some more information. So today, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about lectures and then two strategies that we have to help kind of break up the expectations. So one is chunking information and one is muddiest points. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about lectures. When I say that word lectures, what kind of comes to mind for you? And you can type it in the chat or you can unmute.
A one-sided conversation.
Yes. Yeah. So Laura says snore. Kelly says a one-sided conversation. Time to tune out, boring. Yes. Probably taking copious notes. Yes, we probably don't have very many positive memories of lectures in our lives, even though we probably have all given lectures. But, when you sit there and you listen to a lecture, even if it's a good speaker, you walk away and that information often doesn't really stick with you. So why do instructors then default to lectures? Why does this happen? And these are kind of my opinions, but I think I'm right. So lectures can feel easier on everyone. We don't have to depend on students to participate. We don't have to depend on students to prep beforehand. And we know with our students, it can be a struggle for them to pre-read or prepare for a class. And so if you are doing an activity that depends on them having done their homework or done the reading, it can be disappointing as instructor when you realize they have not prepared. And also lectures avoid those uncomfortable silences. You want to ask questions and you want your students to participate. And whether it's in person or on Zoom, there can be times where it's just hard to let the silence happen in the classroom. So you ask a question, and if no one answers in a few seconds, you just move on. So I think it's understandable why a lot of us lecture. Oh, there you go. And Kelly says, some students fuss if they do not get a lecture and feel they are teaching themselves. And I can see that with our students. I can see them having that reaction. And I think it's twofold. Some students, it's because maybe they're a non-traditional student, and so they are used to lectures. And if they don't get a lecture, they feel like, why did I bother to even come? And then younger students, because they might not want to or feel comfortable participating, may kind of like the lecture as well. So that's a good point. Sometimes students like it too. But there are drawbacks of lectures. Student engagement really suffers because lectures are passive types of learning. And what we really want to focus on are active types of learning, because that type of learning is much more efficient. When I teach students study skills, I always say, if you're passively learning, it's kind of like riding your bike down the highway. Eventually, you're going to get to your destination, but it's going to be uncomfortable. And all these cars are passing you by getting there. And especially if you are in courses like nursing, where there's a lot of content, you want to be driving, you want to be in the high occupancy vehicle lane so that you can go as fast as possible. And passive learning is not going to get you there. Another kind of drawback to lecture is it can discourage students from preparing for class, because if they think the teacher is going to tell me everything I need to know, I don't have to look in the book. I don't have to, do any sort of reading. And then this is kind of the golden ticket, if you will, that we can tell students. Students fail classes more often when they are lecture-based because it does not require that active learning and that active participation. So when students can tune out, they do. And it means that they fail more often. So, and I think Laura might be able to put that link in the chat for the study if anyone wants to really dive into active learning and why students do better. So what now that I've, harshed the buzz on lectures, let's think about what can we do to, make our things more active and more efficient for our students. So one option is chunking material. And what this involves is a 5 to 10 minute presentation, and it can be a video or it can be live on a very specific piece of content. And then after that information is presented, the students immediately complete an activity based on the topic. So rather than, I am, a history person, I've taught, history and political science at Del Tech. So rather than teaching a whole class about the whole world, all of World War II, right? And then expecting them hopefully to remember everything that I said, maybe I focus on the immediate events surrounding the start of World War II. And I give them a 5 to 10 minute video or lecture about that. And then I ask them to write from memory a timeline that kind of encapsulates that run up to the war. Or make a list, or in a group, draw a political cartoon that could represent it. You can do a lot of different activities and you can be really creative. But the idea is you take this small piece of content, lecture on it for 5 to 10 minutes, and then give your students an activity. And so this can be done in class, it can be done online, or it can be done asynchronously. If you have an async class, you can provide the video and then give them the activity that they would do right away. And you could still try to do it in groups. Laura and I have talked about in previous Lunch and Learns how to kind of, facilitate that, or you could do it individually.
And Carrie Ann, yesterday when we were talking about this, I wanted to make sure that this was an idea you had. I wanted to make sure that it came up because it was so brilliant. That when you're going to give that 5 to 10 minute presentation, tell the students what they're going to do. So you're prepping them for the work that they're going to do. You're giving that idea. So for instance, if you're going to have them create that timeline, you say, okay, I'm going to talk to you for about 5 to 10 minutes. And at the end of that time, I'm going to want you to make a timeline. Then the students have purpose setting, and they know that they're going to need to keep track of those dates and those special events so that they can then create that timeline. Instead of getting to the timeline, they're like, oh no, I took the wrong kind of notes. It's not supporting this application that I'm trying to do right now. I loved your idea of the political cartoon. If you tell them, you're going to have to do a political cartoon, then they could really be looking for those controversial comments about the beginnings of the World War, so that then that way they would know what they would need to caricaturize or whatever. I don't know if that's a word, but I tried. But anyway, I'm sorry. I had to make sure I said that because it was such a brilliant idea that you were talking about yesterday. I didn't want to miss it here.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And what Laura's talking about in education, we call this metacognition. So this is when students are thinking about their own learning. So you are prepping them by saying, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to talk to you about this, and then this is what you're going to do with the information. And it makes those students sit up and pay attention because they know they're going to have to do something after you talk with them. In most lectures, you lecture for 45 minutes and then students leave the room. They don't have to do anything with that information. So you don't want it to be like a gotcha, like, okay, now put away your notes and everyone take this test on the information I just gave you. You don't want it to be like that. You want it to be a learning experience, a formative assessment. So something that you're looking at, how much have they learned? You're not going to grade them really harshly on this. You really want it to be, maybe kind of rough, but showing their learning process. So we want to think about, why is this useful? And I want to think about that because I know we're always giving you guys more things that you should be doing, right? And it's exhausting. So want to at least tell you why we think this could be helpful. It keeps students engaged, like I said, especially, and giving them that forewarning of saying this is what we're going to do. It requires active participation. So a student can't just sit there and do nothing. It does not require the student necessarily to prep before class. You want to make sure that you're giving them that information in that chunking lecture that they're going to use next. Because again, we don't want it to be a gotcha. And then it quickly reinforces the material you have presented. And we know from studying how brains work and how people learn that that's really important. If I am going to give you information about a skill or a topic, then I want you to practice with that material right away. It doesn't really help for you to practice with it 2 weeks later. So having this short time where you're lecturing and then giving the activity really primes the student's brain for learning. So here I wanted to give lots of examples because I feel like that really helps things become concrete. And my first example is math, and I think math really lends itself to chunking already. Typically math teachers don't lecture for 45 minutes. They, show students how to do a problem or how to complete a certain activity, and then they have them practice it. So that's kind of the, chunking that we're all used to, because we're all used to that practice. But we can incorporate that into many, many different types of classes. So I know Gwen teaches English. So in English, explaining how to create APA citations, and then students do their own APA citations with articles you've provided. And I was thinking with this type of activity, what you could do, and Kelly could do this too, because you still have to do APA in nursing, is, give them, articles that you've provided. So then you have a key, and they can, once they're done, they can check it against the key to see have they done it correctly. Most likely they will not, because APA is tricky and you're always going to be missing a comma or have something capitalized, not supposed to be capitalized. But they can see, they can check the key, and then they can say, oh, I have to fix this, this, and this. And they go back and fix it. And then, then they're done the activity. So not only are they practicing right away, but then they're checking their work right away and fixing it right away. And, APA, just like math, is the kind of thing you have to do over and over. That's why our math teacher always gave us 25 math problems to do. So, doing this multiple times can give students really the reinforcement they need to really master a skill. If we are in, a lab environment, you can talk to the students about how to prep the lab for an experiment, and then have them write a guide for the next class so that they are becoming the teachers. You can describe to students how blood pressure medicine works, and then ask them to draw a diagram explaining the process. Or teach students how to write an outline, because our students have not been taught how to write an outline. And then students can work together to write an outline for their group paper, or they could do it.
So how exciting is this? So we've just had about 7 minutes of talking about chunking, and we are modeling what we're talking about. So this is your opportunity for a little bit of active engagement. We'd like you to take about 3 minutes to come up with a topic that you could present in 5 to 10 minutes in your course through lecture, sharing that information with them, a presentation, and then an activity that students could do on that topic. So we'll give you just a few minutes to think about that. And there's our timer.
Yeah, and it did work. I hadn't tried
beautiful.
That yet, Laura.
And you can pop that right into the chat, or feel free to unmute to share out loud if you would prefer that instead of typing. And I think I see a message from Gwen also that she had said they practiced APA in class today, actually near and dear to her heart.
And that's how I did it. So
Great.
I was like, I'm off the hook.
Gwen's the model. So you provided some articles for them to create citations, or?
We're working with a provided article, and they're writing an essay that includes that and an article they found. So the planning document, they have to, here's what I had to do. I had them do is to find what they thought was the author's claim or main point and copy and paste it as a quotation and use APA style. And I showed them where APA style is in the common modules for quotation. Then they had to change the quotation to a paraphrase and use APA style to cite the paraphrase. And all this was from provided material. So now, since I'm on Zoom, I don't know how many actually did it, but they had the opportunity.
That's fabulous that you
Yes.
gave them the opportunity. And if you ever wanted to explore the possibility of either shared documents for your Zoom time so you can monitor how they're doing it, or you could also just have them write one of those citations into the chat then if you needed to have a check so that other students could see it as well. As those are a couple ideas.
That's a good idea. Well,
So-
I'll eventually find out when I check the work. So
Right.
I'm finishing my chat.
Right.
That's fabulous. And if they write it into the chat, I guess that would be kind of a formative way to help see how.
That's a good idea. I hadn't thought about that, but that's great.
Excellent. Yay. We are inspiring each other.
I'm afraid to see what I get in the chat. But anyway, it's a good
that's okay.
idea. It's
Yeah,
a great idea.
It's kind of like how we used to have students come up to the board and do things in class.
Right.
So, it's kind of,
I like
mimicking
that.
that. Yeah.
Right.
So
Excellent.
Kelly's example for chunking was creating a disease timeline. So they have a video on it and examples and then tips for actually creating the timeline, close out the chunk. So I think that's a great example. I thought of one for economics, Danielle, which was students have a hard time understanding resources in economics. They tend to think about things just like natural resources like gas and wood. So providing a short discussion on resources and then asking students to make a list of the resources they have in their car and how they might use them in an emergency. Noting that, everyone, you have limited resources and how can you kind of maximize them.
Excellent. And for the several individuals who just joined us, just to kind of sum this up, we were talking about instead of long lectures, 45-minute lecture, something like that, we present information in smaller pieces and chunks of about 5 to 10 minutes. And then we intersperse active learning activities in between those chunks of information to help students process what they've been learning. Because we might also remember that old theory about like the parabola kind of thing, that we remember everything at the beginning and lots of things at the end, but the middle is kind of lost on us. If we're doing it every 5 to 10 minutes, we have more opportunities to remember more of that stuff in the middle because we're processing it.
Right, exactly. So here are some different things that you could do after you have that 5 to 10 minute lecture, just to give you, ideas of activities that are active learning activities. One thing that came up a lot in literature was a 1-minute paper reflection. So if you are providing students with information about a concept that maybe they're not really that familiar with yet, asking them to take the next minute and just write down all of the things that they remember about what you said. A pro-con list when it's something that, kind of lends itself to that. A case study, a diagram, a how-to guide, a debate, presentation. And then the last one, maybe something that you might not have heard this phrase before, generative questions. When we teach study skills, we say these are kind of the gold standard for the most efficient use of your time, are generative questions. And the way that I explain this is I say, if I'm teaching a history course and I'm going to give my students a test on World War II, what questions might I ask them? So now I'm gonna put you on the spot, even though we're not in history class and you're not studying World War II, what questions might I as an instructor ask my students about World War II? Okay, oh, we got somebody, we have some brave soul. What are the three main catalysts for the start of World War II? Very good. Michelle Keenan gets an A. What else might I ask students? And we can think very basic. Why are we studying World War? Oh, Laura, that's a good one. Timeline.
That was from
yes.
Gwen. That was
There
from
you go.
Gwen.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Credit where credit is
Timeline.
due. That was from
Right.
Gwen.
When did World War start? When did it end? What else might be important to know? Who won? Who was fighting, right? Why were they fighting? Who were the US allies? Exactly. And the more that we do this, the more you can see, we could come up with 100 questions, right? And we're not even studying World War II. And the same is true, let's say we're in science, and I'm going to give my students a test on the cell. Okay, so what questions might I ask about the cell or cells? Do cells die? Oh, very good. How are they made? How are they created? Label the parts of the cell. Yes, always love a good label. Parts and function. Yes, alterations from normal. Very good. Types of cells, life cycle of cells. And so again, this is called generative questions, is when students think about what questions would my instructor ask me about this topic? And what we typically tell students to do is, okay, here I've given you this, this chunk on diabetes. And now I want you to think about 3 to 5 questions that I might ask you about diabetes. Write down the questions and write down the answers. That process, again, is related to metacognition. It's related to how do you think about learning and how do you think about how your brain works. And it's a really powerful tool to get students into the mindset of preparing for an exam. And then you can suggest, okay, now switch with a partner and see if you can answer the questions that the other person wrote about this topic. Okay, so now we are going to leave chunking. And all I can think about now is chunky peanut butter. I don't know why, but now that's all you're going to be able to think about. Now we're going to leave chunking and we're going to move on to muddiest points. And this is the second strategy that you can use rather than kind of leaning on a lecture. Muddiest points are an activity where you ask students to spontaneously write about things that they don't understand. And we call them the muddiest points, like the places where you get stuck. And it's helpful because I know we've all had this. We think that our students understand a concept. And so we move on and then we realize that in fact, they do not have an understanding of that concept. And now they don't understand this other concept that we introduced. In political science, I was teaching that last year, I realized that federalism was a concept that students really just could not get their heads around. The idea that we have this national government and then these smaller state governments and the way that those governments interact. And I kept trying to do this big umbrella, little umbrella. And I had to eventually think of, I've got to think of other and different ways to explain this because obviously my big umbrella, my little umbrella was not working. So how do we go about doing a muddiest points activity? So just like with the chunking, you want to tell the students beforehand. You want to prep them so that they are thinking about their learning. Decide if you want to make it a group activity or an individual activity, and prepare some prompt questions. Because a lot of times if you just ask students, well, what do you not understand or what do you not know? They'll just look at you like this. So you need to kind of give them a little bit to go on. Then decide, are you going to have them write it down, make a video, type it into D2L? And then once you've collected the information, you want to provide some supplemental instruction or some alternative resources on muddiest points. And, I think we've all known back to math. I remember very vividly when I was taking pre-calculus in high school that my instructor, we were doing sine and cosine, which is tough stuff. And I could not get it. And he could only explain it one way. And that way did not make any sense to me. So I actually, because I'm a super nerd, I went to my previous, I know Michelle's a super nerd too, she understands. I went to my previous year's math teacher and asked her if she could please explain sine and cosine to me because I did not understand the way Mr. Barfield was explaining. And she, lovely teacher that she was, explained it in a totally different way and it made sense to me. So, if you just like for me with the umbrellas, I kept thinking that that would make sense to my students, but it wasn't making sense. And so I really had to, brainstorm and look things up and find alternate resources so that we could explain it in a different way. And then to wrap up this activity, you want to check in with your students to make sure that they finally do get this concept. So here are some of the prompts that you can use in Muddiest Points. You can say something like, what vocabulary in this lesson do you not understand or is unfamiliar to you or was, difficult? And I think this is really important because I know that our students struggle with reading comprehension and vocabulary. And I remember way back when I was in the writing center, the English students had this article, and I wish I could remember the title. There was a word in the title that none of the students knew what it meant, but yet they just all read the article anyway, and then didn't know what the article meant because they didn't know what this word meant. No one thought to look up the word, right? Even though they're right at a computer with Google. And so this, not only is it helpful in this context to say, hey, was there some words that maybe you didn't know, you weren't familiar with? But it's also helpful to get students thinking about that if they come across a word they don't know, they can look it up. And I know that seems like silly and very obvious to us, but it's not a practice that many of our students do. So getting them to do that can be really helpful. You can ask them, if there was a concept that was confusing, and you can also frame it in a different way because some students don't want to admit that they have something that, is difficult. So you can say, what's something you'd like to learn more about? And maybe they feel comfortable sharing it that way. And then finally, what questions do you still have? So what I want you to think about now, I'm going to actually turn this over to Laura.
So, especially if you've had some experience teaching your courses, even at least once, but maybe you've taught it over the course of several sessions or several semesters, what are some of the muddiest points in your courses? So where are some parts that students tend to struggle? And you can feel free to write that in the chat or unmute to share. And we really just want to start being kind of cognizant, maybe a little bit proactive of knowing when we can ask students to talk to us about the muddiest point because we know one's coming up. Vocabulary. They need the basics first. So sometimes even just those words, and as Carrie Ann said, they didn't know the words, they were on their laptops, but they didn't look them up either. Sometimes students feel like they should know them, and therefore they don't feel empowered to go look them up. Difference between informative and argumentative writing. Really, what is that difference? Helping students be able to recognize how might your writing change in those two types of writing. We've got an entry also from Gwen, students struggling with reading vocabulary, another vote for vocabulary, that those are some of the places that really can create some of those muddy points in your courses. I'm sure, Kelly, that vocabulary plays a role in nursing as well. And Kelly also added from applying the information to the written assignment. And that's an interesting thing also. I know that we've had strategies where we use graphic organizers, for instance, to help students. I think even that happens at the college levels sometimes. But students don't always know how to transfer that information from this visual graphic into something that makes paragraphs. So some students might require that extra support to be able to do that. And another vote from Gwen, the APA style can be very foreign to students. Just trying to recognize those pieces of it, know when it should be italicized or not. And sometimes it's a big change for students as well. When you typically write a title, you're capitalizing all the words, but in APA, don't you dare, so we have some different approaches there as well. Nice work, everyone. You are really, really digging into your courses and trying to think of how you can support your students. Nice job. Oh, and healthcare policy versus a guideline is this week's challenge. I'm trying to recognize when is it, like law, when is it good practice, right? Thank you, everyone.
So here, now we're going to go back and just think about then, once we know we have these muddiest points, what can we do? And I mentioned some of this earlier, providing supplemental resources can be really helpful. That's something, it's a tenet of universal design for learning, which is something that we in CCIT are really proponents of, where you don't just give students one resource and say, this is the be all end all about APA, diabetes, or photosynthesis, Instead, you want to give them multiple resources so that they can get multiple perspectives. And so that way, if some students learn better watching a video and hearing someone explain it, others look at a diagram and that makes sense to them. And, it can help you. Ooh, I'm trying a Muddiest Points discussion board. Awesome, Michelle. If that can help, it can also help your understanding, because even though we all know our topics, there's still, information out there that is left for us to learn. So by doing that research yourself, you can come to a better understanding of the information and then share that with your students. Also, asking students to teach the concepts to classmates. Now, you might get pushback, like Kelly said, where the students don't want to teach each other because they want the instructor to teach them. But, sometimes having a novice explain things makes more sense to someone than having an expert explain them. We've done all of our, subject matter for so long that we know it. And so sometimes it can be hard to break it down into the very basic elements for our students. Going back to APA, they might they know it's something they're supposed to do, but they have no idea why. And sometimes we don't always explain the why to students because we assume they know tourism and, research, academic writing. Come on, people. But, because they don't know that, they don't understand where it fits and why is it important. Check with colleagues for alternative ways of explaining information. In CCIT, we're really lucky because we talk a lot amongst each other and we share. And hopefully you have that in your department as well, where you can say, gosh, these students really just don't understand the difference between informative and argumentative essays. How do you guys, broach that? Because sometimes our colleagues are hiding all this great information and they're not sharing it with us. So this gives them an opportunity to share. And then polling students for understanding. Giving them the chance to anonymously let you know, do they understand a concept or do they not? And, again, it can be a poll, it can be a mini presentation or a 1-minute paper or a debate. For that informative argumentative, you could have students rate, give them different examples and then say, is this informative or is this argumentative? And that repetition and practice, and then a student having to defend this piece of information is one or the other, can help other students see how that thought process works and how people come to that conclusion. Any questions about some of the ways that we can deal with muddiest points? We're going to do our own muddiest points now. Aren't you guys excited? So I would love for you to answer one of these questions, either unmute or in the chat. Whether it's what topic from today would you like to learn more about? Which strategy has something that's unclear or confusing to you? And was there any vocabulary that I used today that was unfamiliar?
I have a muddy point because I was late.
Sure, go for it, Danielle.
So I teach asynchronous.
Mm-hmm.
So did you talk about chunking and asynchronous? I mean, I know I try to keep my videos short
right,
but it's a little different because it's up to the student to chunk the information that's given to them. But did you speak to that?
We did. So we said, what the kind of the basic tenet of chunking is that you provide short, information, and then students are going to have to do something with that information right away. So you could make it really all part of the same assignment. Because that way students kind of click once and then their fingers are tired and they're not able to click again. So you would say to the student, whether it's a discussion board or another type of assignment, watch this video and then you would have the activity right there for them. So it might be, draw an outline of photosynthesis or a diagram of photosynthesis, or it might be, label the parts of this, picture, or it might be write, a summary of this process that I just explained, and just have it built right into the assignment.
Yeah, and I think Michelle and Kelly's questions might also help with what I'm asking.
Okay. So here, let's go back up. So how many chunks are too many, Kelly? That's a good question. And you don't, with any of these, you don't want to overuse it, or else, kind of the magic is gone. So, you want to think about if you're doing something synchronously, you might have, if you have like do you guys have longer classes in nursing, like 3 hour, or is it shorter?
BSN is all asynchronous.
All async. Okay.
Yeah.
So, you would want to you could have different modes for chunking. So you could have video and then activity, read a reference and then, or read, a resource and then do a discussion board. So that it's not always just video, answer questions. But you want to think about maybe just like how we have our courses broken up in D2L, where we have them in modules and then submodules, thinking about, taking all the material that you have and breaking it into those smaller pieces. And then where are those kind of vital content, areas going? Does that make sense? Okay, our next question is, what are some of the good technology tools that can help with chunking? That's a great question, Michelle. So I mean, one of the things that first comes to mind is Edpuzzle. Have you used Edpuzzle, Michelle? So what you can do is you can take a video, either a YouTube video or your own video, and present information, and then have the video pause at certain points, and students have to answer questions before they can go on. So that is one way where you can really build it into the technology. So like Danielle's saying, they can't even get away from it. They have to answer that question before they move on to the rest of the video. So it's built in. Trying to think of what other, we could use Canva, which is what I use today to present. I don't know if you guys have been using Canva, but using that along with something like Camtasia or Screencast-O-Matic, which are both video recording programs that can record on your computer. So you can make like a really lively video that also has text, text-based information in it. Kelly, recommendations for naming the chunks to encourage engagement. That's good. Do you mean naming the assignments or naming kind of the content?
The content itself. We end up defaulting to part 1, part 2, part 3. Well, eventually you stop wanting more parts, right? So is there a way to catch people with how you name it or how it's structured, maybe within HTML templates or another way? But I'd stop clicking after part 4 of anything, right? If I got that
right,
far.
Right. I mean, I think I would go with naming it about the content. And we just actually had a very lively conversation in CCIT about naming conventions. We went on for a while. But I think that naming it content, so that way students are focused more on what they're learning versus I've got to get through these 5. I know for myself, even when it's silly, even when I'm scrolling through like Instagram and I see photos, some reason I'm just like, I just want to get to the end of this person's photo album, which doesn't really make sense. But so I think if it's numbered, they're kind of thinking of it in a way of like, I just want to get through these steps. Whereas and you could do them as, you could do pithy, you could do puns, you could do them as questions, kind of, I'm thinking like the tabloids. Students don't know about tabloids. I remember I tried to introduce this topic before, like Hillary Clinton has alien baby, and the students had no idea what that was. So don't mention tabloids, but some kind of puns, something that is like a little bit clickbaity, could get them a little more interested in looking at what you have. And numbers also work. I used to work as a ghostwriter, and they said for titles, it's like top 10 ways to do this, or 3 reasons why you should do that. So I would stay away from part 1, part 2, part 3, and instead, try to kind get in touch with that creative side and think about how you could name these so that students want to watch them, just like for us, if the administration sends us something, we'd want it to be something that had a good title that would get us interested in wanting to know what is this content here. Okay. So Laura had answered some with Edpuzzle and chat and Padlet. If we build in the Muddiest Points, we'll be able to view it. Yes, I'm just trying to read all the all the chats. The good, the bad, and the ugly. There you go. Or some, like for a dermatological video, it could be like, what's that on your face? If you need, you know what, Kelly, if you need titles, you come to me and I will give you all the good titles.
And deemed appropriate, right?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
That's where I find the gray area.
Right, exactly. So my call to action to all of you is to think about the amount of time that you lecture, and if it's an asynchronous, it would probably be just the amount of time, not that you lecture, but that students kind of have to just read gray text with nothing else happening. And set a goal to decrease that by, a number that feels good to you, 10 or 20 or 30%. And really that goes back to the beginning. And I know a few of us weren't here in the beginning, but lectures and other types of passive learning activities don't give our students that that experience of active learning. And what happens is it's a much less efficient way for students to learn and for us to teach. Because eventually they will get that information, but it may not be in the 7 weeks or 15 weeks that we want them to master that information. So if we can push students to be more active by providing, short lectures in chunking, providing short lectures, and then giving them an activity to go along with that, that's going to really help them become more efficient and more in charge of their learning instead of sitting there and just waiting for you to bestow all your wisdom onto them. And then with Muddiest Points, it's important that if you are providing them information, that you are doing those check-ins to see if they are understanding. And Muddiest Points gives you a very formalized way to do that. A lot of times we are in a lecture or in a class and we ask our students if they understand, and they kind of nod their heads or just look at us. And again, that silence is uncomfortable. Or in asynchronous, we assume if nobody, raises a problem, we assume that they are getting all of this content. So providing those activities where we say, let's stop and do you really understand how blood pressure works? Do you really understand oxygenation? Do you really understand how to write an outline? So that before we go any further, we can make sure if you don't, we can address those issues. So we do have some resources. I believe Laura put them all in the chat as we were going through our discussion. And really what they are, just more opportunities to read about Muddiest Points and chunking and to get some different ideas for how other instructors use them. You can use it in any kind of level of course, which is really nice. So whether it's an intro level or, advanced, you can, take advantage of these strategies and help your students. So do you guys have any questions or anything? We actually are done a little bit early, but Laura and I are happy to answer any questions or talk more about chunking or Muddiest Points. And thank you so much for all your participation today. As you guys know, I'm sure from teaching on Zoom, that it's deathly terrible when you have participants and they don't participate. And then you're like, am I frozen? What's happening? Does anyone hear me? So really appreciate it. And hopefully this will be able to kind of re-inspire you to get your students engaged and, get them up and learning. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Danielle.